chapter 7, we looked at quadratics, finding zeros, and finding the vertex. So in this review, first step is we're going to look at how can you find zeros. There are several different methods. We're going to start with factoring first. So the first one's already factored. You can tell that because you have the parentheses already. And if something's factored, we learn that the factors are the opposite of the zeros. So for the first one, x minus 3, you want to think what makes that equal 0. And we could add 3 to each side. So one of the zeros is at positive 3. Another way we did it is we just thought about what's the opposite of the factor. So what's the opposite of 4? Well, negative 4. And you can get that same result if you were to set the equation equal to 0. So for this first quadratic, if we were to multiply it out, we get standard form, but in factored form it gives us the zeros. If we were to graph it, at 3 there would be a 0 or an x-intercept, and at negative 4 there would be an x-intercept, and your graph would look something like this. Let's try the next one. X squared, I'm going to subtract 36 from each side to get 0 on one side. We can factor that. This is difference of squares. This is x plus 6, x minus 6 equals 0. And there are two zeros, again, for this quadratic, negative 6 and 6. So if you were to graph that at negative 6 and at positive 6, you would see x-intercepts. It might look something like this. Okay, so to find zeros, you can factor. And you can set each factor equal to 0 and solve to find the zeros. To find the zeros, you can also use quadratic formula. So quadratic formula, the first step is you want to find a, b, and c. A is the number next to the x squared, b is the number next to the x, and c is the number by itself when there's 0 on one side of the equation. We plug in a quadratic formula, which is x equals opposite b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So if we plug in, we get x equals the opposite of negative 2 is 2, plus or minus the square root of negative 2 squared minus 4 times a times c all over 2a. Okay, so you plug in, and then you do want to calculate these three numbers separately to minimize any error. So we have x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of, and you would just type this in. So we have negative 2 squared minus 4 times 2 times 5. Alright, so we type that in, and we get the discriminant, negative 36, okay. So negative 36 all over 4. And this means that there's no real solution, there's two imaginary roots. So to find them, you can keep going further. I'll go this way. So you have x equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 36. I'm going to pull out that I, that imaginary number, over 4. And then we can simplify the square root of 36 as 6. So 2 plus or minus 6i over 4. And then to simplify further, we can reduce this fraction. 2 divided by 4. I can just write 1 plus or minus 3i over 2. So I can divide everything by 2. So here are your two imaginary roots. Another way you can find the zeros is just to type it in your calculator. See where it crosses the x-axis. So let's just open a graph page and type in this quadratic for number 4, which is x squared minus 2x minus 8. And you can find the zeros that way. So you can use menu, analyze graph, and find the zeros. But here you can count pretty easily. We can see that one's negative 2, and we can see that the other is 4. So for number 4 right here, we can say that x is now negative 2 is 1, 0, and the other one was 4. So you can do it by graphing as well. All right, the discriminant is the thing under the square root sign. It's that b squared minus 4ac. And the discriminant, if it's positive, it tells you that there's two real solutions. If your discriminant is 0, it tells you there's one real solution, so it crosses your x-axis once. And if your discriminant is negative, it tells you that there's two imaginary solutions, so your graph never touches. So it could look something like this. It could be below as well. So the discriminant tells you how many solutions there are, either 2, 1, or 0, depending on the sign or the number underneath. All right, we looked at imaginary numbers in this section. When you add, you just combine like terms. So we have a 3 plus a 2, that's 5. 4i minus 5i is negative I. So you put your real number first and then your imaginary. If you multiply it out, you might want to FOIL or use a box. I'll use a box. We have 3 plus 4i. We have 2 minus 5i. So we have 6 for the first box. 2 times 4i is 8i. 3 times negative 5i is negative 15i. And 4 times negative 5 is negative 20i squared. Remember that I squared does equal negative 1. So we have 6, and they combine like terms here, minus 7i. Negative 20 times negative 1 is 20. Put your real numbers first, so we have 26 minus 7i. We also learned synthetic division in this chapter, or in the chapter after that. So we'll take a look at this. We want to see if you can divide this x cubed minus 2x squared plus 3x minus 7 by x minus 2. Put the 0 on the outside, so the factor is x minus 2, the 0 is 2. Put your coefficients on the top. Pull down the first number, and then you multiply. 2 times 1 is 2, and you add, we get 0. Again, you multiply. 2 times 0, 0. You add it together, we get 3. And then we get 2 times 3 is 6. And we get negative 1. So this is not a factor. And if it's not a factor, you don't have to write it in factored form. If you do want to write it in factored form, remember we dropped this down a power because we divided by x, so this would be x squared plus 0x plus 3, and the remainder is negative 1 over x minus 2. So here's how you could write that out. We looked at finding the vertex of something in vertex form. You can graph it if you want, but think about how this graph shifts. This graph shifts. This is left, right 1, and then it goes up 6, so the vertex is 1, 6. This is where your graph changes direction, so it might look something like this. Changing it to standard form, use order of operations. So we're going to do x minus 1 squared first. So we have x minus 1, x minus 1, put this in our box. We get x squared minus x plus 1. Let's write that better. Plus 1. And then if I write that out, we get x squared minus 2x plus 1. But then you have this 2 on the outside here. So we're going to put the 2 here and distribute. We get 2x squared minus 4x plus 2. And the last step is don't forget about this plus 6 at the end. So we'll combine like terms and get 2x squared minus 4x plus 8. And here's your new equation in standard form. Okay, so again, those were the notes. Here are the practice problems for you to try for Chapter 7. Answer key should be on Schoology, so you can check your answers, and you can use this to help you make a note sheet.